This is Nish talking about how he almost ruined James Acaster's special. Nish Kumar is one of the most polarizing comedians, and I got to have a conversation with him. It seems like people can't really decide what they think about Nish Kumar. Some people love him, and some people hate him, and some people aren't even agreed on how to pronounce his last name. This polarity probably comes from the fact that he's a political comedian. So if you like Nish Kumar, finesse that subscribe button. And if you hate Nish Kumar, give that like button a nice caress. Because then we can decide who has more numbers. I had a podcast with Nish Kumar a few years ago, and I'm going to take you through the whole episode so you don't have to watch the whole thing. This is never revealed before audio that is on a very niche podcast on Spotify that you are going to love. So please watch till the end and enjoy. The concept of being a comedian is something that some people don't really understand, because essentially when you first start doing stand-up, you're a fan of stand-up first, and really the people who end up doing stand-up are people who are crazy about other stand-up comedians. Like, I started doing stand-up because of the Dave Chappelle special, Sticks and Stones, and if it wasn't for that special and me trying to be like that, I never would have started stand-up. And no matter what you think about Dave Chappelle now, I have my own opinions. I can't ever deny the impact that that special has had on my life, and I would not be where I am today if it wasn't for that special. So this episode was essentially a bunch of comedy nerds discussing all the things about comedy that they love and giving each other recommendations. I have to be honest that this podcast is one of the most eye-opening experiences of my entire stand-up career. It taught me a lot about how to be not only a comedian, but also a comedian of color. COC, if you will. Although me and Nish are objectively not the same race, Nish taught me something very valuable that I've carried my whole time through stand-up, and that's to not apologize to white people, just for not being white. If you like my stand-up, you know exactly how I don't do that. But here's another thing that conversation actually probably taught me, and it's the fact that he spoke about how you kind of do comedy in reverse. And I think he was quoting someone else when he said this. And he said, essentially, all the famous comedians that you guys love essentially started in small, dingy nightclubs and small, dingy pubs, and then eventually got to a place where they were doing theaters and huge venues. And this effectively means that in stand-up, you basically do the hardest gigs first, then the easiest gigs last. Because eventually, when you become a professional comedian, you're doing gigs that are catered to you as a stand-up. But when you start off, you're doing dingy little places with people who aren't even interested in watching comedy. So listen to what Nish has to say here.
Stephen Wright always says that the process of being a comedian, it's like it almost happens backwards. Like, you start doing the most difficult possible gigs. I remember him saying in an interview, he was like, now, obviously, if I go and do a gig, I'm doing it to 2,000 people in an amazing theatre that was designed for performance. They're all facing the right way. There are structures and things in place for them to get drinks or go to the toilet if they want. They've come to see me. And he was like, it's the easiest possible way to do comedy. Whereas the entire comedian career is backwards. Whereas 6 people in a room that holds 500... some of whom didn't even know there was going to be comedy, certainly have never heard of you. It's the hardest thing. And I would say you've taken that one step further and added the al fresco element.
I think this is a really valuable life lesson in starting stand-up. And what doing this has taught me is that most of the time when we're doing stuff, you can't just expect to be good at something straight away. But also, the thing that you're doing sometimes might actually be harder than you think it is. And often, you need to do the hard part to get to the good part of the thing you're trying to do. So, for example, in fitness, not that I'm a fitness guru, I refuse to make this a fitness guru channel, but not that I'm a fitness guru, but the fact that when you're going to the gym at first, it's really painful, it's hard, you're sweating, you're overweight, you can feel the rubbing of places that shouldn't rub next to each other. But the longer you go on and the longer you continue, eventually going to the gym becomes pleasurable and actually something you look forward to. And that's the same thing about stand-up. For whatever reason, people start doing this weird thing where they talk to strangers in a pub, but eventually it becomes something that you love and you actually can't live without doing. And I think if you take that model and you apply it to other things in your life, it actually makes it a lot easier to push through the part that kind of sucks to get to the part that's really enjoyable. But as a fan of comedy, and keeping this more comedy focused, one of the things that I really loved about this podcast is I got to see someone who's relatively well known and famous, like Nish Kumar, show how he's so inspired by someone like Chris Rock, who's basically a titan of comedy. And these two people who I see as successful in their own right kind of had this weird connection where Nish basically grew up watching Chris. From watching a lot of Chris Rock's material, I really see that impact that Chris had on Nish Kumar.
I think the first piece of stand-up that I ever remember being able, like I feel like I always knew what stand-up comedy was, but I think certainly the first conscious step I had of like, I'm watching something that's a stand-up comedian doing stand-up was watching Chris Rock. The first one I saw was Bigger and Blacker, and I remember seeing he has a routine in that show about how there's no point in being homophobic or anything because whoever you hate will end up in your family. And if you hate gay people, you will have a gay uncle or a gay son. And there was a whole bit in it where he then says the thing about your uncles is that they prepare you for life, because you have, a gay uncle, you have a stealing uncle who steals stuff. And then he had this, and then you have a molester uncle. Everybody has an uncle who your mum is like, don't leave your kids with Uncle Johnny. And then there's this bit where he says, and then you get molested and your mum gets angry with you. And he does this act out of your mum yelling at you going, I told you what would happen if you hung around with fucking Johnny. Now walk it off. And I remember it was so jarring seeing somebody just speak about that contentious subject matter. And then my friend had family in America, and so he would often come back with bits. This was, the kind of pre-internet era, or at least the era of dog shit internet, when information was not traveling at the speed of light. But my friend came back from America with this book called Rock This, which I now recognize to be an unbelievable cash-in. But it was a sort of memoir in the looser sense of the word, but it was actually transcriptions effectively of Chris Rock's stand-up routines. And that was like the first, because if you'd watch Bigger and Blacker if it was on Channel 4, but it wasn't the same way of buying stuff. It wasn't as easily available or accessible. And so like one of the first long form pieces of stand-up comedy I ever interacted with was effectively Chris Rock's cash-in memoir that was really him, like transcriptions of his stand-up routine.
We all know that Nish is quite political, and I think that his political opinions can be something that rub people the wrong way. But me personally, I basically share the same politics as Nish, so it's not something that's ever really annoyed me. But even if it did, I listen to loads of comedians that say stuff that I sometimes find reprehensible. But the thing about Nish is the fact that his comedy is something that I find really interesting, because you can tell that he's been influenced by people like Chris Rock. Because you can tell he has a clear fascination with politics. Like, here's him talking about a Chris Rock joke and how Chris basically bottles down the essence of white privilege.
The quickest distillation of the idea of white privilege can be distilled by Chris Rock and Bigger and Blacker saying, if you want to know how great it is to be white, all the white people here, none of you would trade places with me now, and I'm rich.
Yeah.
And that there isn't a better way to illustrate what is meant by the slightly nebulous and often misused phrase white privilege than that routine for Chris Rock. He then says, there's a white one-legged busboy in here that wouldn't trade places with me and is thinking, I'm just going to ride this white thing out. There isn't a better way of...
I know a lot of people are going to be like, white privilege isn't real, or racism isn't real, blah, blah, blah. This is YouTube. I know that there's a venomous pit waiting in the comments. But look, you can't deny that this joke and the way that Nish talks about it so perfectly boils down the concept of white privilege. Chris Rock is a millionaire, and a lot of white people would probably not trade places with him. But it doesn't matter what your political opinion is, because ultimately it's a funny joke. And here's another part that I love. It's when we started talking about comedians who have done things that we all disagree with. So in the same way that some people don't like Nish for his political opinions, here we spoke about the big bads in comedy, Bill Cosby and Woody Allen. And this is what Nish had to say about them.
It's also like, listen, it probably is good. We may as well address... and the problem is, when you're talking about particularly the history of stand-up comedy and the history of men doing stand-up comedy. When you talk about the history of men doing anything, you talk about the fucking charity sector, and there are elephants in the room. But listen, in the world of men doing stand-up comedy, there are several elephants in the room, and I'm sure we'll touch on all of them at some point in this conversation, because one of the first stand-up comedy album I ever bought when I was 18 years old was the Nightclub Years collection of Woody Allen stand-up. So it's difficult to say we didn't know, because we kind of did, but we just didn't care. And it's the interesting thing about Woody Allen is that a lot of the allegations that are swirling around were made in the very early 90s. But what seems to have brought it home for a lot of people is Dylan Farrow's letter on the subject. And that's so there are huge, stand-up comedy is like the Olympics. Like, there are gold medals that are awarded that should be taken back, really. There are gold medals awarded that need to come with a big whopping asterisk around them.
And this is another part that I really want to show you guys. If you're watching this video, you've probably watched my James Acaster video where I talk about our podcast, or my Jimmy Carr video where I talk about our podcast. But what I want you guys to really know is the fact that Nish Kumar and James Acaster and Jimmy Carr are kind of all friends, and they kind of all know each other. And if you are a fan of James Acaster, then you probably know that James Acaster has a Netflix special where he has 4 specials in it. And this is Nish talking about how he almost ruined James Acaster's special.
Frustratingly, again, I can't really say anything about him because I know him too well. But if I didn't know him, I would say that Acaster's Netflix collection is, I can, again, I can't publicly endorse him.
No, what do you mean you can't publicly endorse him? You literally publicly endorsed him by being at that recording and doing that noise throughout the shows. Have you listened? Have you watched those, Ricky?
The 4 ones. Yeah, like
it was potentially a mistake for them to seat me and Ed Gamble together. We did warn them against doing that, but it's listen, it's a toxic instrument. Unfortunately, by virtue of the volume of my laugh, I've made my feelings about those Acaster specials extremely clear.
I did the warm-up for them, and it was equal parts the best weekend of stand-up I've ever seen and one of the most stressful things I've ever been involved in.
Well, what he was trying to do
was incredible.
Insane, because the way, it's just the weird thing about how it's consumed now. People look at it and they go, what a wonderful, complete piece of work. But he recorded 4 shows in a weekend twice.
Really?
So he did 4 hours of stand-up over one weekend, 4 completely different shows twice.
Why twice?
There's a sort of common convention when you record a stand-up show that you record it twice. Okay. Most of the film stand-up is a cut together of 2 different shows. An example of that's not is live on the Sunset Strip, because in front of Live at the Sunset Strip went so badly. It was a complete disaster. There is footage of it available, and you see it crops up in the prior documentaries every so often. But he fucking died on his ass the first night of Live at the Sunset Strip. Yeah, and so what you're seeing is the second. But it'll often be. It's often. Listen, there is an element of it's a security thing in case one of the gigs goes badly, but more, and certainly this is true of the shows that Acaster did. They were all good. Like I think I was at all 8 of the recordings, but I was at a lot of them. But they certainly, it's more to do with camera positions. If you get 4 cameras in, you can have camera positions in one place, and then you get different coverage. And so then when it cuts together, it becomes, it allows you to get a more seamless. It allows for a more immersive end product if you can reposition the cameras, and it gives you 2 angles on the same routine. So I mean. Yes, it's one of those things where when you're at that recording, you're it's like being at a fucking, this is what it must have been like to be at a Velvet Underground gig in the late 60s, I
have to say, if Nish Kumar, if you ever watch this, I can't explain enough how much this podcast really did a massive influence on me. And your podcast, Pod Save the UK, I love it. It's great. But to all you guys who've watched this video, Thank you so much for taking it in. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want more videos like this, then leave a comment, let me know. And also, if you want more videos like this, check out my James Acaster one and my Jimmy Carr one. There's a lot more on the way, but I'll see you later, guys. Have a good one.